The September fog hung thick and heavy over San Francisco Bay, a dense gray shroud that swallowed the familiar world and replaced it with cold, silent dread. On the deck of the transport ship, the 247 Japanese women stood in tight clusters, their torn, dirty Imperial Japanese Army uniforms offering little defense against the damp chill that seeped into their bones. They were young most, between 18 and 30, and they had served as nurses, radio operators, translators, and clerks across the Pacific. Now they were cargo, surrendered and defeated, awaiting the fate their officers had promised: torture, abuse, and a humiliating death. Ko, a 22-year-old nurse from Osaka, clutched the steel rail until her knuckles were white. The salt spray mixed with the lingering smell of diesel fuel and their own unwashed misery. Her hair was matted and stiff with weeks of grime, and her face was hollowed out, a map of poor rations and unending fear. Beside her, Yuki, who had operated a radio in the Philippines, stood frozen, her jaw clenched. She had memorized the propaganda. Americans were savages. They would strip Japanese women of dignity. Death would be a mercy. Through the oppressive gray, the Golden Gate Bridge emerged slowly, impossibly. Its red towers rose, untouched, perfect, seeming to touch the sky. In Japan, most bridges had been bombed to rubble. Here was a structure that mocked the utter destruction they had left behind. "They will kill us when we land," Ko whispered, her voice a thin thread that shook in the wind. Yuki said nothing, her eyes fixed on the approaching shore. The ship's horn blasted 3 times, a deep, mournful sound that made the women flinch and gasp. Some began to pray softly, others stood paralyzed, their minds blank with terror. As the ship groaned to a dock at the military pier, the American soldiers appeared. The women pressed against the rails, searching for the demons and monsters they had been promised. But something was wrong. The soldiers weren't snarling. They weren't shouting threats. They weren't even pointing rifles. They were standing in loose formations, talking casually, smoking cigarettes. One young man even waved a casual, almost friendly gesture up at the ship. "Did you see that?" he waved. Koei breathed, gripping Yuki's arm. "It's a trick," Yuki whispered back. "The only rational explanation. A softening up ritual. A cruelty disguised as comfort." The gangway lowered with a metallic clang. American officers appeared, clipboards in hand, followed by a Japanese-American soldier who stepped forward to translate. His voice, speaking their language, was calm, lacking the cruel bark of imperial officers. "You will exit the ship in single file. You are prisoners of war under the protection of the Geneva Convention. No harm will come to you." The women exchanged confused glances. Geneva Convention. Ko had never heard the words. As they began the agonizing, reluctant descent, each step felt like walking toward an execution. The fog swirled, and the American soldiers watched, their expressions neither angry nor cruel, but something far more unsettling, curious, almost gentle. Ko's foot touched American soil. She braced for horror. Instead, the first soldier she passed simply smiled at her. Not a cruel, mocking sneer of victory, but a simple, open, human smile. It was, she realized, more terrifying than any weapon. The women were led into a large, white building that smelled sharply of disinfectant, but also something else, something warm and floral they couldn't name. Inside, female American nurses waited a second, profound shock. The Americans had sent women to process them. "Remove your uniforms and place them in these bags," the translator instructed. "You will be given clean clothing after your medical examination and shower." Panic rippled through the group. To undress in front of strangers, in front of the enemy, was a violation of modesty, a humiliation worse than death in Japan. Ko felt her face burn with shame, yet they had no choice. Slowly, reluctantly, they began to undress, moving quickly to try and erase the shame with speed. The American nurses moved among them with a gentle efficiency that offered no judgment, no mockery. They simply handed each woman a white towel. The medical examination was quick, professional, and thorough. They checked for wounds and disease, their soft English words meaningless, yet their tone reassuring. One nurse noticed Ko's trembling hands and placed her own hand gently on Ko's shoulder. "It's okay," she said in English. Ko didn't understand the words, but she understood the kindness in the woman's eyes, and she suddenly burst into tears. Then came the showers. They were led into a large, tiled room where steam filled the air, warm and thick. The translator explained that they should wash thoroughly, and that soap would be provided. Soap, real soap. The women stood frozen, staring at the white bars on small shelves. They picked them up slowly, as if handling something precious and fragile. It was smooth, heavy, and smelled like lilacs in spring-like, a world that hadn't been destroyed by war. Yuki turned the handle and gasped as hot water poured over her. Not lukewarm or cold, but truly hot. She hadn't felt hot water in over a year. Ko scrubbed her skin until it was pink, washing the dirt and the fear away. The soap lathered thick and white, and the smell of flowers surrounded her like a dream of her mother's garden in Osaka. Around her, women were crying, laughing hysterically, or simply standing under the water, letting the months of exhaustion wash away. When they emerged, they were given simple gray dresses and soft cotton socks. They looked in the mirrors, hardly recognizing themselves, clean. "I forgot," whispered an older woman named Tomoko, touching her own face. "I forgot I could look like this." But beneath the relief, a darker feeling stirred. Confusion, shame. They were supposed to be suffering, tortured. Instead, they had been given soap, hot water, and clean clothes. What kind of enemy does this to their prisoners? They were led into the large, immaculate mess hall. The smell hit them, powerful and dizzying. Bread, meat, coffee, butter. It was the overwhelming scent of a nation that had never known scarcity, and it was a form of psychological attack. Several women stopped, unable to move forward. The women shuffled to the tables, their posture rigid, eyes wide and frightened. This couldn't be real. It had to be a trick. The food must be poisoned. This is the last meal. American soldiers, now dressed in white kitchen uniforms, appeared with large trays, placing plates down with gentle care. Ko stared. Roast chicken, golden and glistening. Mashed potatoes with a pool of brown gravy. Green beans. A thick slice of white bread with a pat of yellow butter. Milk. Coffee. She hadn't seen this much food in 3 years. No one moved. They sat in a silent tableau of terror and desire, staring at the food as if it might vanish. "Please eat," the translator urged gently. Finally, Yuki picked up her fork, the metal shaking in her grip. She cut a small piece of chicken and lifted it. She chewed slowly, eyes closed. The taste, rich, savory, real, exploded on her tongue. She swallowed, and then she started to cry. That sound, Yuki's profound, broken weeping, was the trigger. The dam broke. Women began to eat, some frantically, others slowly, their tears falling onto the plates. Ko bit into the soft, perfect bread, spreading butter with trembling fingers. She had eaten bread made from sawdust and tree bark. The richness of the butter made her dizzy. Across the table, Tomoko was crying too hard to eat. She held a piece of chicken in her hand, her whole body shaking with sobs. "My children," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "My children are starving in Tokyo, and I'm eating chicken." The guilt was a physical blow. While they feasted, their families were starving in the ruins of bombed cities, eating grass soup. The enemy was feeding them better than their own country ever had. Some pushed their plates away, unable to continue, consumed by shame. The American soldiers watched from the edges, unreadable. One young soldier whispered, "They're crying. Should we do something?" The older soldier replied quietly, "Just let them eat. They'll be okay." Ko wasn't sure. She wasn't sure of anything. The enemy was cruel. The enemy was supposed to hate them. But this ... this felt like something else entirely. It was a kindness that felt like the beginning of a far more profound, dangerous, and total kind of defeat. After the agony of the feast, the women were led to their barracks. They walked in a daze, their bellies full for the first time in months, their minds struggling to process the overwhelming reality of abundance. The barracks were simple. Clean wooden buildings, painted white with neat rows of beds inside. Not mats on a cold floor, not piles of straw, but actual beds with metal frames, mattresses, pillows, and thick folded blankets. Ko chose a bed near a small window and sat down slowly on the mattress. It was soft, not luxurious, but yielding beneath her weight. She hadn't slept on a mattress since leaving Japan 2 years ago. Beside her, Yuki ran her hand over the coarse wool of the blanket, her expression distant. "It's thick," she murmured. "It's winter in California, and they gave us thick blankets." Each bed had a small wooden trunk at its foot for personal belongings. The translator explained that they could write letters home if they wished. Paper and pencils would be provided. Letters home. The idea was a painful connection to the devastation they had just fled. Tomoko sat on her bed, burying her face in her hands. "This is wrong," she whispered to the women round her. "Everything about this is wrong. We are prisoners. We are supposed to suffer. We are supposed to pay for what our country did." She looked around the neat, warm room. But instead, they treat us like human beings. That night, darkness fell, and the lights were dimmed. The women lay in their beds, wrapped in their warm blankets, listening to the unfamiliar, ambient sounds of an American military base. Trucks rumbling, soldiers calling out in English, the low, jazzy hum of a distant radio. Ko pulled her blanket up to her chin. She was warm, full, clean, and safe, and she had never felt more confused or terrified in her entire life. She thought of the propaganda films, the officers, the lies. She thought of the soldier who had smiled, the hot water, the chicken. Everything she knew was a lie, and that realization was more devastating than any battle. The days quickly settled into a routine that felt surreal in its relentless ordinariness. The morning bell at 6:30 a.m. was gentle, not the aggressive siren of a military alarm. Breakfast was served at 7 a.m. in the mess hall, oatmeal with brown sugar and raisins, scrambled eggs, toast with jam, fresh fruitapals, oranges, sometimes even bananas. This abundance appeared every morning, as if by magic, feeding their bodies while simultaneously starving their ideological resistance. After breakfast came work assignments, but they were not the brutal labor details expected. Ko was assigned to the camp hospital, helping the American nurses, Helen and Margaret, with light tasks, folding bandages, organizing supplies, cleaning equipment. The work was almost gentle. They treated her not as an enemy, but as a colleague. They patiently taught her English words for supplies, often sharing pieces of their own lunch with her. The most shocking realization came every Friday, payday. Each woman received a small amount of camp script, paper currency usable only within the camp, but currency nonetheless. This money allowed them to visit the camp canteen. The canteen was a small store stocked with impossible luxuries. The women stood transfixed before the candy display, like children at a shrine. Hershey's, Nestle, Baby Ruth chocolate bars. In Japan, chocolate disappeared years ago, reserved only for the military elite. Here, enemy prisoners could buy it with their wages. There were also cigarettes, lipstick, hand lotion, notebooks, and handkerchiefs with embroidered flower items that made life something more than mere survival. Yuki bought a chocolate bar on her first visit. She carried it back to the barracks like a treasure, unwrapping it slowly, breaking off a single square. The pure sweetness melted on her tongue, and she closed her eyes, savoring the richness. "I'm eating chocolate," she whispered to Ko. "We're prisoners of war, and I'm eating chocolate." The moment was a private, sweet betrayal. The routine continued. Substantial meals, rest periods, and even recreation. The Americans had set up a small library stocked with Japanese books. On Sundays, there was no work. They could rest, write letters, or attend services. A Buddhist chaplain visited monthly, and Christian services were available weekly. This domestic, gentle routine began to wear down their resistance more effectively than any torture. Their bodies grew stronger, their cheeks filled out, and color returned to their skin. But with physical health came intense mental turmoil. Every day of comfort was a day of crushing guilt. Every meal was a reminder that their families were starving. Every bar of chocolate was a betrayal of everyone's suffering back home. They couldn't stop accepting it. They couldn't refuse the food or the warmth, but the internal war was constant. At night, the women gathered in small, hushed groups. Some clung desperately to the old beliefs, insisting this was a calculated trick to gain intelligence or cooperation. Others began to question everything. The enemy was not the monster they had been told. The enemy was something far more complicated, far more human, and far more frightening because of it. Tomoko often sat apart, consumed by the memory of her children. Her shame was physical, a cold knot in her stomach that persisted even when she was full. She would look at her hands, now clean, her fingernails healthy, and compare them to the memory of her mother's hands, gnarled and thin, foraging for grass in the ruins. By the letters from home, when they finally arrived in late October, were like knives. Ko's first letter from her mother was on thin, worn paper. Her mother's once elegant handwriting wandered across the page. Tokyo is gone. Our house is rubble. Your father and I live in a shelter. We eat once a day if we are lucky. Your little brother grows thinner each week. He asks about you constantly. ... Ko read the letter 3 times, her hands shaking. She stared at the roast beef and carrots on her dinner plate that evening and saw her little brother's gaunt face. She pushed her plate away. She was not alone. All around her, women were receiving similar letters describing starvation, homelessness, and death. The contrast between the abundance surrounding them and the devastation of their homeland became unbearable. The guilt spurred an intellectual confrontation. The letters made their healthy appearance a mark of betrayal. One day, Yuki was working in a field detail outside the camp fence, harvesting vegetables. At lunchtime, the American guard, a quiet man, opened his metal lunchbox and shared his sandwiches, ham and cheese, on white bread with the prisoners. "My wife makes extra," he explained through the translator. "She knows you girls are hungry." His wife, a woman he had never met, an enemy, had made extra food for them. Yuki took the sandwich, bowing deeply, tears streaming down her face. That night, she wrote in a journal she had started keeping, "The guard's wife sent sandwiches. She doesn't know us. We were her enemies, and people died because of that. But she sent sandwiches. How am I supposed to hate people like this? How am I supposed to remain loyal to an empire that let me starve while the enemy feeds me?" The physical change in the women, the returned glow to their skin, the flesh on their bones was impossible to hide. Tomoko stood in front of a mirror in the washroom one morning, staring at her healthy reflection. "I look like I did before the war," she whispered. "I look fed." Then she thought of her children's hollow eyes in the last photograph and turned away. The guilt, a crushing weight. This was the torture, being shown mercy when you expected punishment, being treated with dignity when you anticipated cruelty, discovering that everything you had been taught about honor, sacrifice, and enemies was a lie, and a lie cut deeper than any blade. The small, casual kindnesses proved to be the most potent force undermining the women's hatred. They were subtle acts of human connection that offered no grand ideological statement, yet cracked the careful walls of fear and resentment the women had built. One afternoon, Ko was carrying a tall stack of folded linens through the hospital hallway. She was still adjusting to the smooth, waxed American floors and tripped on an uneven board. The linens exploded upward, scattering white sheets across the clean hallway. Ko immediately dropped to her knees, her face burning with shame. In the Imperial Army, such clumsiness would have earned her a sharp rebuke, perhaps worse. Instead of anger, she heard laughter, not mocking, but warm and gentle. She looked up to see Captain Miller, a young American doctor she worked alongside, grinning at her. He knelt down instantly to help. "Happens to everyone," he said in English. Ko didn't understand the words, but the tone was clear. He wasn't annoyed. He was just helping. Together, they gathered the sheets. When they finished, he handed her the stack, gave her a friendly, mock salute, and walked away whistling a tune she didn't recognize. An officer, an American officer, had knelt on the floor to help an enemy prisoner pick up laundry, and then he had smiled. Who were these people? Another day, Yuki was walking back from the fields when she heard musica bright, brassy sound, utterly foreign to the somber military marches she knew. She followed the sound to an open window of an American barracks. Inside, young soldiers were gathered around a gramophone, listening to a jazz record and laughing. One soldier noticed her and waved her closer. "You like music?" he asked, gesturing. Yuki nodded hesitantly. The soldier disappeared and returned with the record. He handed it to her. "Gift," he said, using one of the few Japanese words he knew. "Purisinto." She tried to refuse, shaking her head, but he insisted. "No, no, you keep it for the girls in your barracks." The record was Glenn Miller and his orchestra. That night, the music filled their barracks bright, utterly American, and undeniably joyful. In mid-November, the American command initiated a mandatory re-education class, though they called it a civics and culture exchange. The women expected propaganda lectures on American military might and the superiority of their race. Instead, they were led to a bare room with folding chairs, where a gentle, middle-aged civilian man named Mr. Thompson began to speak through the translator. He taught them about the concept of democracy. "In America," Mr. Thompson explained, using an apple as a prop, "the government does not own the citizen. The citizen owns the government. The people are the masters. The leaders are the servants. It is built on the idea that the life and opinion of the poorest person," he held up the apple, "is worth just as much as the most powerful generals." The women listened in stunned silence. This directly contradicted everything they had been taught about the emperor and the state. He then presented a concept that truly bewildered them, questioning authority. "You have the right to look at this apple," he said, holding it out and say, "I believe that apple is poisoned, and you have the right to ask your leaders why you should eat it. This is not dishonor. This is how the system checks itself." Yuki raised her hand hesitantly. "A revolutionary act. But if every person questions, how is order maintained? If we do not obey without question, is that not weakness?" Mr. Thompson smiled patiently. "It is the greatest strength, because when you obey, you do so because you have chosen to. because you have found the answer satisfactory. You follow the law not out of fear of the officer, but out of respect for the law itself. Your obedience is earned, not demanded. Tomoko, who remembered a pre-war Japan with subtle political currents, leaned forward, her eyes wide. "I read about it," she whispered to Ko, "before the books were banned. The idea that people can question authority, that leaders serve the people. I thought it was a fantasy." The lesson wasn't propaganda designed to praise America. It was a philosophical statement that implicitly indicted their own country's system, one built on blind loyalty, and the idea that suffering for the state was noble. The climax of this period of ideological warfare came in late November, when the first cold snap hit California. The women woke one morning to frost on the windows, their breath visible in the air. They huddled under their blankets, dreading the onset of winter cold, a cruel reminder of the suffering their families were enduring. Backfest. The American commander made a simple announcement through the translator. "We've ordered additional blankets and warm coats for all prisoners. They should arrive by next week. In the meantime, we've increased the coal for your stoves. Stay warm. No fanfare, no expectation of gratitude. Just a simple, logistical statement that the enemy had noticed their cold and were taking care of it." Tomoko sat at the table and burst into quiet, helpless tears. "They notice when we're cold," she choked out to the women around her. "The enemy notices when we're cold and brings us blankets." She thought of the winter her family had spent in Hiroshima 2 years prior, burning furniture because the military had requisitioned all the coal. She thought of her own government, which had looked at its citizens and seen nothing but resources to be used and discarded. The cognitive dissonance was unbearable. How could both things be true? How could Americans be capable of dropping atomic bombs and also capable of such gentle, methodical care? "They can do both," Yuki said slowly during the night debate. "They can destroy their enemies completely and then treat them with mercy afterward. That's not weakness. That's strength. Terrifying strength." The realization was that their enemy's power stemmed not just from military might, but from a terrifying moral flexibility that allowed them to choose mercy over vengeance, dignity over cruelty. By December, the internal war raging within each woman had become more brutal than any external battle. Ko was learning enough English from Nurse Helen to understand basic commands and simple conversations. Helen, patient and kind, had even told her, "You're a natural at this. You should be a nurse after the war." The words "after the war" implied a future, a possibility of existence beyond the barbed wire, which was itself a terrifying concept to a woman who had been prepared only for honorable death. At night, Ko read her mother's letters under the blanket. Hunger, cold, desperation, her little brother growing weaker. And here she was, gaining weight, learning English, being called a natural by an American nurse. The guilt was a stone in her chest. Every bite of food felt like a betrayal. She was living better than she ever had in Japan, even before the war. And she was doing it in enemy captivity. What did that make her? A survivor? A traitor? Yuki's struggle was ideological. She had been a dedicated patriot, a true believer in the Emperor. Now, every belief was cracking. She had been taught Americans were racist and would treat Japanese as subhuman. Yet she saw casual respect every day. She had been taught American culture was corrupt, yet she found herself humming the jazz melodies from the gifted Glenn Miller record. One evening, Yuki wrote in her journal the words, "A confession. I have become the enemy. Not because I am being held by Americans, but because I have started to see them as human. And in seeing them as human, I have betrayed everything I was taught. But if what I was taught was a lie, then what was I loyal to? What did I sacrifice for?" The debates in the barracks grew louder, more desperate. They needed to make sense of the senseless. Fumiko, a hardliner, insisted that kindness was a facade, a political performance. Sachiko, a young clerk, countered, "I've seen more respect here than I ever saw in the Imperial Army. I watched officers beat soldiers for minor infractions. Here, I see soldiers who joke with each other, who treat their officers like human beings. That's not weakness. That's something else." The realization that they had been lied to about the enemy, the war, and the meaning of honor was an exhausting, painful, yet necessary truth. They were trapped in a psychological no-man's land, too changed to return to who they had been, but unable to fully accept who they were becoming. The women entered December, trapped in their psychological stalemate. Their minds still bound by the concepts of Japanese honor and self-sacrifice, could not reconcile the daily physical reality of warmth and food. The tipping point arrived with the American Christmas celebration. The women watched in fascination as the Americans decorated the recreation hall, stringing lights and hanging ornaments on a large fir tree topped with a shining star. They had never seen anything like the extravagance. The commander announced through the translator that the prisoners were invited to attend the Christmas party, promising special food, music, and gifts. Gifts for prisoners of war. The concept was absurd. Most women attended out of curiosity. They sat stiffly, watching American soldiers perform songs and clumsy skits designed to be funny. Their humor sometimes lost in translation, but their effort undeniable. They were trying to give their enemy prisoners joy. Then came the gifts. Each woman received a small, brightly wrapped package, tied with a ribbon, as if it contained something precious. Ko opened hers with trembling hands. Inside, she found a bar of soap, a comb, a small mirror, and a chocolate bar. Simple, practical things, yet presented with the dignity of a meaningful offering. She stared at the gifts in her lap, and something inside her broke open, not in a painful way, but like a seed cracking to let new life emerge. This was not a calculated political strategy. They weren't trying to buy loyalty. They were doing this simply because this was how they treated people, even enemies, even prisoners, because it was Christmas. This was the dangerous truth. American power came not just from bombs and bullets, but from the terrifyingly simple idea that every person had value, that even your enemy deserved basic dignity. This was the ideology Japan had been fighting against, the idea that the individual mattered more than the collective. "It's not a weapon," Yuki whispered to Ko, tears streaming down her face as she clutched her own wrapped gifts. "It's just who they are." That's what makes it so devastating. Tomoko stood up, walked to the front of the room, and bowed deeply to the commander. Through the translator she spoke, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for treating us like human beings. We were taught to expect cruelty, but you have shown us something different." The commander looked profoundly uncomfortable with the gratitude, his face slightly red. "We're just following the rules, ma'am," he insisted. "Geneva Convention requires proper treatment, but they knew better. Following rules that protected your enemies choosing mercy when you could choose vengeance, that was everything." As the party continued, the collective exhaustion of resistance finally set in. They could not maintain their hatred in the face of this relentless humanity. Following Christmas, the civics and culture exchange lessons shifted, becoming less about American government and more about philosophy. Mr. Thompson began to explicitly address the dissonance the women were feeling. "The war was fought between systems," he explained. "One system told you that you were valuable only so long as you served the state. Your health, your life, your body all belonged to the collective. The other system, which we call democracy, says that your value comes simply because you exist. Your rights are not earned through sacrifice. They are inherent." He pointed to a clean white sheet on a table. "When you arrived, you were given this sheet. Why? Did you earn it? Did you ask for it? No. It was given because you are a human being, and a human being deserves a clean bed. Your enemy gives this because that is the law of the individual, and that law is stronger than any emperor. This concept your value is inherent with the final, devastating piece of the puzzle. It demolished the foundation of their ideological loyalty, which had been built on the nobility of suffering and sacrifice. If suffering was unnecessary, if dignity was an automatic right, then the entire structure of the imperial cause was built on a lie. Fumiko, the hardliner, stood up in anger. "But you killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. The atomic bomb. Does that show inherent value?" Mr. Thompson paused, his face etched with sorrow. "That is the contradiction you must struggle with. Great evil can be done by a system that also believes in great good. But that contradiction does not change the truth that your own system denied your humanity while your enemy restored it. That is the truth you must use to build your future." His words did not exonerate the Americans for the cruelty of war, but they provided a framework for understanding the kindness of the camp. They realized the true battlefield wasn't nations. It was between an ideology that saw humans as tools and one that saw them as individuals worth protecting. The inevitable, shattering climax came in January 1946. Ko was working in the hospital, organizing medical supplies in a storage room. She moved past a large glass cabinet and caught a glimpse of her reflection. She stopped, staring. The woman in the glass was not the hollow-eyed, gaunt creature of the transport ship. This woman had round cheeks, clear, healthy skin, and bright, alert eyes. She looked young again, alive. The haunted look of the war was completely gone. She looked better than she had even before the war, when stress and scarcity had been the norm. The enemy had done this. The enemy had restored her to herself. Ko's hands began to shake violently. She braced herself against the cabinet, her breath coming in short, choked gasps. The full, crushing weight of the betrayal crashed over her. But it was not betrayal by the Americans. It was betrayal by her own country. Japan had taken her youth, her health, her innocence, and used them as fuel for its war machine. Japan had fed her propaganda instead of food, ideology instead of medicine, demanding her ultimate sacrifice while never once valuing her individual life. Japan had told her suffering was noble. The Americans had shown her that her dignity was essential. She slid down to the floor, her back against the cool cabinet, and began to sob. These were not quiet tears of guilt. They were deep, primal, wrenching sobs of grief for the girl she had been who had believed the lies, and grief for the years wasted serving a cause that had never cared if she lived or died. Nurse Helen found her there 10 minutes later. The American woman took one look at Keo's face and understood instantly, somehow, without words. Helen sat down on the floor beside her, not touching her, not trying to fix the breakdown, but simply sitting with her in her grief. "It's okay," Helen said softly. "It's okay to be angry. It's okay to feel betrayed. You were lied to. You have every right to grieve for that." In that moment, Keo's entire worldview didn't just crack, it shattered completely. The enemy, a woman whose country had been at war with hers, was offering comfort during a breakdown caused by the truth. This was what democracy looked like. This was the philosophy that recognized inherent worth, regardless of which side of a war you were on. Japan had lost the war, but more importantly, Japan's entire ideology had been proven hollow. That evening, Keo stood in the barracks before the assembled women. Her voice was quiet but steady, echoing with the finality of total surrender to truth. "I saw myself in a mirror today," she said. "I looked healthy, and I realized that I look better now as a prisoner than I ever did as a free citizen of Japan. And that's not because America is perfect. It's because Japan failed us, completely and utterly failed us." She looked round the room, meeting sympathetic and resistant eyes. "I'm not saying we should forget who we are, but we need to acknowledge the truth. We were lied to about the war, about the enemy, about what our country was fighting for." Silence filled the barracks, heavier than any fog. Then, slowly, one by one, women began to nod. They had all seen their own healthy reflections. They had all felt the cognitive dissonance. The enemy had treated them like human beings, and in doing so, had revealed that their own country never had. The resistance, the denial, the desperate clinging to old beliefs, all of it, washed away in a flood of painful, liberating truth. The transformation was complete. They would always be Japanese, but they would never again be the women who had believed the propaganda. There was no going back. As winter turned to spring in 1946, a new set of rumors began to circulate through the camp. Repatriation. Ships were being prepared, and arrangements were being made to send the women back to Japan. This news, which should have brought overwhelming joy, the end of captivity, the return home instead landed with the crushing weight of dread. Ko lay awake at night, her stomach twisted in knots. The Japan, she remembered, the land of cherry blossoms and order, was gone. Her mother's letters painted a picture of utter devastation. Tokyo was rubble, food was scarce, and disease was rampant. She would return to that chaos, healthy, well-fed, and with flesh on her bones. How would she explain her survival to her starving family? How would she look her little brother in his hollow eyes and tell him she had been eating roast chicken and chocolate while he foraged for weeds? The shame of her health was heavier than the shame of defeat had ever been. Yuki confessed her fear to Ko one evening as they sat on their beds. "I'm afraid to go back," she whispered. "What kind of person does that make me? Japan is my home. My family is there. But the thought of leaving here... .. Double quotes. She trailed off, unable to complete the traitorous thought. Tomoko, the oldest, finished the sentence for her, her voice heavy with sorrow. "Do you feel guilty because this camp, this prison, has been kinder to us than our own country ever was? And that is not something we can ever say out loud." The conversations in the barracks became tinged with this unspeakable shame. They were admitting the unthinkable. They had come to prefer captivity in America to freedom in Japan, not because they loved America, but because basic human needs, food, shelter, dignity mattered more than the abstract concepts of loyalty and patriotism their leaders had used to justify starvation. The shift in loyalty led to the most direct act of ideological rebellion yet. Small groups of women began to approach the American officers and the translator, asking a desperate question. Could they stay? Was there any way to remain in America rather than return to Japan? The answer was always the same: no. The Geneva Convention required repatriation. They had to go back. But the very act of asking revealed how profoundly they had changed. These women, who had been taught that death was preferable to dishonor, were now begging to stay with their former enemies rather than return to their homeland. The propaganda had promised that Americans would break them, and in a way, the propaganda was right. But the breaking had come through the simple demonstration that there was a better way to live. Yuki, who had married an American soldier during the occupation, caused a scandal in her family, but she didn't care. She had seen enough to know that love and kindness mattered more than national pride. In her final days at the camp, Ko sought out Nurse Helen. She didn't ask to stay, knowing the futility of it, but she wanted to understand. "Why?" Ko asked, using her halting English. "Why were you so kind? Why the blankets, the soap, the gift?" Helen gave her a small, sad smile. "We were taught to see you as individuals, Ko, not as a mass of enemies. That's the difference. My brother fought in the Pacific. He died there. But that doesn't mean I stop seeing you as a person who needs a warm blanket, as a parting gift." Helen gave Ko her own nursing textbooks, dog-eared and worn. "You are a natural, Ko. Go home and be a nurse. Take care of your people with dignity. Take the best of what you learned here, not the worst." The last weeks in the camp were spent in a whirlwind of emotional exhaustion, not relief. The women knew they were carrying a truth back to a country that was not ready for it. They began to mentally prepare for the inevitable confrontation with their families and with the hardliners who would judge their healthy appearance as a moral failing. Tomoko gathered the younger women one last time. "When you go home," she instructed, her voice firm, "you must remember what we learned. The government, the military, they demand blind faith. But we learned that questioning authority is not only acceptable, but necessary." Sachiko argued that they must become internal missionaries, carrying the philosophy of individual dignity back into the heart of the new, fragile Japanese democracy. The challenge was immense. How to teach people to value themselves when they were only focused on survival? Pugh, struggling with the abstract intellectual concepts, wrote her final entry in her camp journal. "The Americans did not win the war with only bombs. They won it with this. The idea that my life matters even when I am the enemy. That is the philosophy that destroyed the empire. And that philosophy is now inside me." The women had to redefine their honor. True honor was no longer blind obedience and self-sacrifice. It was survivability, clarity, and the ability to distinguish truth from propaganda. They were still Japanese, but they were now carrying an enemy ideology, the ideology of the individual into the defeated nation. The ships departed in April 1946. The women stood on deck, watching San Francisco Bay disappear. The Golden Gate Bridge shrank on the horizon, not as a symbol of terror, but as a monument to the paradoxical mercy they had experienced. Many cried. Some waved goodbye to the American guards who had come to see them off. The journey was crowded and uncomfortable, but they were fed regularly and treated with basic dignity, nothing like the nightmare voyages of the war years. When the Japanese coast finally appeared, the women crowded the rails, straining to see home. What they saw confirmed their worst fears: devastation. Cities reduced to ash, harbors filled with half-sunken ships, the coast scarred by bombing. As they sailed past Hiroshima, the total erasure of the city, the true scale of the atomic bomb's power, became shockingly visible. They docked at Yokohama. The reality hit them with full force. Skeletal buildings, rubble-lined streets, people in rags, children with distended bellies begging for food. This was what they were returning to. Kao stepped off the ship onto Japanese soil and felt no joy, only a crushing sadness and a wave of acute guilt. The women around her cried, not with happiness, but with horror at what their country had become. They were processed, given minimal supplies, and released. The ultimate test of their transformation was now beginning, integrating the painful truth of their survival into the reality of their nation's suffering. The final journey from Yokohama was a descent into stark reality. Kao boarded a train to Tokyo, watching the destroyed landscape roll past the windows, burned forests, collapsed bridges, and ghost towns where bustling cities had been. The contrast between her memory of Japan and the scene outside was a physical shock, magnifying the guilt she carried. She found her family in a makeshift shelter constructed from sheets of metal and salvaged wood in what had once been a prosperous neighborhood. Her mother had aged 20 years, her face a web of deep lines. Her father was sick with tuberculosis, frail and coughing. Her little brother, now 12, was so thin, Kao hardly recognized him. His eyes were too large for his sunken face. When they saw Kao, healthy, round-faced, and clearly well-fed, their first expression was overwhelming joy. followed instantly by confusion, and then by something that looked undeniably like accusation. "You look well," her mother said carefully, the words devoid of true celebration. "The Americans, they treated you well." Ko nodded, unable to speak, tears streaming down her face. She understood what her mother wasn't saying. "You were eating while we starved. You were safe while we suffered. You were with the enemy while we lost everything." The guilt she had felt in the camp was a distant shadow compared to the cold, paralyzing burden she felt now. Her own survival was the sharpest proof of her country's failure. The women scattered across the devastated country, attempting to rebuild their lives in a nation that was rebuilding its identity. They rarely spoke of their experiences in the American camp. The contradictions were too painful, the truth too isolating. They quickly learned that their health was a political vulnerability, and their stories of enemy kindness were acts of treason in the eyes of many. They faced subtle judgment. The hardliners who had clung to the old idea of honor saw their healthy bodies as evidence of moral compromise and a lack of patriotic suffering. Many returned soldiers and civilians believed that the prisoners should have endured torture or even died for the emperor to maintain national dignity. The women became silent carriers of the truth. The enemy was not the monster, but the messenger. Yuki, facing the profound starvation and the rigid cultural expectations of her family, made the final, definitive break. She sought out and married the American soldier she had corresponded with during the occupation. It caused a tremendous scandal, but Yuki did not care. She had seen that her value lay in her individual humanity, not her nationalist identity. She moved to California, raising 3 children who grew up bilingual and bicultural, proving that identity didn't have to be singular or pure. As the decades passed and Japan transformed from ashes into an economic powerhouse, the women quietly integrated their lessons into the fabric of the new, fragile democracy. They had been irrevocably changed, and they dedicated their lives to applying the philosophy they learned in captivity. Ko followed Nurse Helen's advice. Using the American textbooks Helen had given her, she became a dedicated nurse. She never married, choosing instead to dedicate her life to healing. In the 1960s, she opened a small clinic in Tokyo, treating every patient, regardless of status or background, with the same principle: inherent dignity and care, a philosophy learned in the heart of the enemy's prison. She kept the worn American textbooks close, flipping through them to remember the woman who had sat with her on a hospital floor while she cried. Tomoko returned to her children and spent the rest of her life as a quiet, powerful teacher. She didn't preach about America, but she taught the next generation to question everything, to think critically, and to recognize propaganda when they saw it. She taught them that their worth came not from service to the state, but from their inherent humanity. The women had found that the simplest objects, the soap, the chocolate, the clean sheets, became profound symbols. They were proof that everything they had been taught was a lie, and that dignity was more powerful than cruelty. The physical comforts had demonstrated the profound philosophical difference. One system used humans as tools, and the other saw them as individuals worth protecting. In her final years, Ko was visited by her niece, a young woman born decades after the war. Ko, now frail but with bright, clear eyes, finally told the full story of the American camp. "So the Americans were good to you?" the niece asked. Wide-eyed, Ko shook her head slowly. "It's not that simple. They dropped atomic bombs on our cities. They killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. They were capable of terrible things." She paused, looking out at modern Tokyo, all glass and steel prosperity. "But they were also capable of mercy, of treating their enemies with dignity. And that mercy changed me more than any punishment could have. It made me question everything, and those questions led me to the truth. A painful truth, but truth nonetheless." Ko's voice was barely a whisper, but her words carried the weight of a lifetime. The most dangerous weapon America possessed wasn't the atomic bomb. It was the simple, radical idea that human dignity transcends national boundaries. She had spent her whole life trying to pass on what she learned, that your enemy might treat you better than your own people, that propaganda is always a lie, and that human dignity transcends borders and nationalism. These women, broken not by cruelty but by kindness, discovered that the real battlefield wasn't between nations, but between ideologies. Then the ideology of the individual had won.